Okay, so let's look at the required Supreme Court cases that we need to know for AP US government and politics. I'm going to go through these cases in chronological order, which may not have necessarily matched up to them in terms of how we covered them in class, but it will give us kind of a better idea of sort of tracking how the Supreme Court changes over time from the first case to the last case that we need to know and we need to understand. We're starting with obviously probably the most important, and that's Marbury versus Madison, which establishes the idea of judicial review. Essentially, the courts decide that they have the power to look at and review any acts of the legislative or the executive branch and decide whether or not they violate the Constitution. This case really sets the table for all the other cases that come after it because it gives the Supreme Court that power as one of the three branches to look at any act, look at any legislation, look at any executive order and decide whether or not it violates the Constitution, decide whether it can be struck down or not. The next case we looked at is McCulloch versus Maryland, and this is a case that establishes the idea of federal laws versus state laws. If you remember, this is a question that is driven behind whether or not Maryland could tax the national bank, and it ultimately established the idea that federal laws supersede state laws and gives the federal government a little bit more power concerning their laws when it comes to how there's a balance of power in federalism in the United States. We also get Schenck versus the United States. This is one of two cases that deals with free speech, and this is one that establishes the clear and present danger clause and decides that that is not protected by the First Amendment. There's obviously a number of different things we've talked about in class, and the idea of what is free speech, what is not free speech, what is protected speech, what is not protected speech. And those are two concepts that are kind of difficult to understand, and Schenck is a good way of sort of looking and establishing how we know whether or not what you say is protected by the First Amendment of the Constitution. We also looked at Brown versus the Board of Education. Hopefully this is a case that is a little bit more of a review for those of you that took either AP US or regular US history. This is a case that's been covered a number of times throughout your high school career, and so hopefully it's one that's a little bit more fresh in your mind and easy to understand. Obviously, this is one dealing with the segregation of public schools and the violation of the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. Next we're looking at is Baker versus Carr. This is the case that established the idea of one person, one vote when it comes to challenging redistricting and the way district lines are drawn when it comes to elections in the United States. Also looking at whether the federal courts could or could not review challenges to redistricting. And so this is an important case where we sort of understand how does this idea of a republic work? How does this idea of representation work when it comes to our democracy? We also covered Engel versus Vitale. This is one, if you remember, dealt with the prayer in schools and how that violates the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. We cannot essentially force children to pray or to take part in a prayer in school, and having a prayer in school, even if it's not compulsory, still violates the Establishment Clause. So this is an important case in a very important time in history as well, in the early 60s, and sort of really sets the standard for this long 1960s where we deal with a few different cases and a few different problems and issues that are going on in the United States, particularly the civil rights movement at this time as well. We also talk about Gideon versus Wainwright. This is another one that some of you may have been a little bit more familiar with, and this is the right to an attorney. I know when we talked about it in class, a few of you connected to Miranda versus Arizona, which is a different case, not necessarily connected to this, but are in a similar vein when it comes to the rights of the accused, when it comes to due process, particularly of the 14th Amendment. This is another case. This is one of the first cases we covered that I think you guys really enjoyed and really found an interest in, and that's Tinker versus Des Moines. And that is the idea of wearing armbands to school to protest the Vietnam War. So this is another First Amendment case where this is actually dealing with symbolic speech as to whether or not the armbands that they wore were not just a violation of their free speech rights, but whether or not they were a distraction to their other students. If you remember, that was really what the crux of this issue was when the debate found its way to the Supreme Court, was saying that these students, even though they had a right to protest, was disruptive for their fellow students in their classrooms with them. So again, a number of cases throughout the 1960s in a very tumultuous period in the United States. We also talk about New York Times versus the United States. This is another one you may have covered in the United States or in U.S. history, whether it was AP or U.S., talking about the Pentagon Papers, talking about Vietnam and the bombing that happened, the secret bombings in Laos and Cambodia. And so this is one dealing with freedom of the press and deciding whether or not the press can publish any information that has to deal with national security and whether or not it puts any members of the armed forces or the government in danger. So this is another interesting one where it really kind of rides the line between what is free speech and what is not free speech, what is protected, what is not protected. We also talked about Wisconsin versus Yoder. This is dealing with Amish families in Wisconsin not sending their children to school past 8th grade because it was not a part of their religious beliefs and their religious tenets. And so the idea that they do not have to continue going to school because it violates the free exercise clause of the First Amendment when it comes to freedom of religion. So if you remember, we talked about those two clauses, the free exercise and the establishment clause. And this in Engel versus Vitale, even though they're coming from a similar point of view, use two different versions of the First Amendment to sort of get their point across when it comes to the decision. We also talked about Roe versus Wade, an incredibly controversial decision. It's always tough to talk about in class. We've had some very good discussions about it. The most important thing, and the thing I tell you guys to remember, is that Roe versus Wade establishes a woman's right to privacy, not the right to an abortion. And that's the one thing what we talked about where we tried to make sure we had a very clear understanding with that in class and that we know really what the court is deciding here and how it's still become such a controversial case 20, 30, 40 years later as it's constantly brought up as a potential case for review. And any time that the Supreme Court shifts politically, this is a case that comes up again and again. We also talk about Shaw versus Reno. This is another redistricting case and whether or not districts drawn, whether they are conscious of race or not, have to be compliant with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So as you can see, this is an act that had been 30 years old at this point that was still being challenged in North Carolina as they were drawing some of the districts. And if you guys remember in class, we went through that kind of fun game where I showed you, is it a voting district or is it a Rorschach test? Well, this is kind of drawn out of that where some of these lines and some of these districts that are drawn just don't look right. And so how do we challenge those things and how do we actually deal with unfair or unlawful districts? We talked about United States versus Lopez. This is one where I told you it's a Second Amendment issue, but it's not. Because really the crux of this issue is whether or not Congress can use the Commerce Clause to regulate possession of a gun in a gun-free zone, particularly in a school zone, and ultimately deciding that because it is not connected directly to the Commerce Clause, they cannot. So remember, even though this is dealing with guns, this is not necessarily a Second Amendment issue. This is more tied to the Commerce Clause and the powers of Congress. McDonald versus Chicago. This one is a Second Amendment right, and this one is a Second Amendment issue, and that is the right of someone to keep and bear arms for self-defense. If you remember, this was an older gentleman living in the city of Chicago who had a handgun and believed that it was his constitutional right to be able to keep it for self-defense in his home. This finds its way to the Supreme Court. And if you also remember, we talked about DC versus Heller in connection with this case as well, and how this case basically clarifies DC versus Heller just a few years after that initial ruling. And the last one we have to know is Citizens United versus the FEC. And this is the idea that money is free speech or is protected speech. And the idea that there are no real limitations on the amount of money that corporations can spend, that labor unions can spend, that people can spend when it comes to elections and fundraising. And this is another one that was very controversial we talked about in class. It's an important one to know and important to understand the context and how it's a recent court decision that is still having effects on politics in the United States and is another one that has continued to come up as a point of contention in every election cycle since its initial decision.